the last year, he has done nothing but spit in the face of the gift I gave him.
Like they added a fucking Knack reference.
What about Knack 3, goddammit? I'm so close to finding out the truth.
He obviously isn't getting a gift this year, but I don't think you should get a Christmas either, until at the very least he says something nice about my gift.
What's going on? Huh, that's odd. I don't remember getting up to being on my to-do list for today. Santa coloring game? Why are you here?
We need to talk.
Hi, I'm JAMm, and do you ever get a gift that you don't really like, but you don't know how to really tell the person you didn't like the gift, but you don't want to hurt the feelings of the person who got you it, so you kind of use it out of politeness instead of sincerity? Yeah, me too, and I'm starting to realize how big of a mistake that was. A year ago, I was given the greatest gift of all, a pair of socks. Then I got a copy of Knack, and I haven't been the same person since. Knack is one of my favorite games to make fun of, because, well, I mean, look at the box art. If that monstrosity can make it to store shelves, so can you. But I have to be honest with you guys, I was making fun of a game I hadn't played until somewhat recently. I know, shock and horror, but in my defense, I like the idea of staying sane, but due to circumstances out of my control, I have the pleasure of replaying such a phenomenal game. So without further ado, Knack is to games what Nestle is to water. Just evil. I genuinely despise this game with every single bit of glass in my body. I frankly do not tolerate this level of lacklusterness on my channel. But I'm willing to make exceptions. Now if you do know what Knack is, then skip to here so you can see why this game is just dookie ass shit. As for the rest of you, Knack was a video game made by Sony's Japan Studios and was a launch title for the PS4. The goal of Knack was to show that the PS4 was more than just FPS and action games. It can have mediocrity too. Knack was also used as a bit of a tech demo to show the power that the PS4 had, by rendering each object of Knack's body separately. Now at this point you might be asking, what is Knack? Knack is the titular character of, you guessed it, Knack. He is a monster-like creature that is powered by ancient relics from a past society. Which past society? Doesn't matter. Look at this f***ing crystal. This game was sold as a platformer when it was first released. Having now played the game, I know that was a f***ing lie. Now if I said I was selling you air and you got H2O2, I would be sent to jail. But when Sony does it, they get a mediocre review score. Nothing says I did bad like a 5.9 from IGN. To say this game is bottom of the barrel is offensive to the barrel. Like that didn't do anything wrong. This is not even a contender for one of the worst games I've played. This is number one, and I'm so sorry I have to tell you about this. Now that you have an understanding that Knack is a game for the PS4, so Knack takes place in a world where goblins are real. They used to be one of the main inhibitors of this Earth-like planet, but the humans became a thing and started absolutely murdering the goblin population. The main plot of this game is that the goblins have big scary weapons like mechs and tanks, and they are using that to take their land back. And the humans don't like that. So the big government makes two arms dealers show off their technologies for a military contract. On one side, we have a Tony Stark type, a guy that is a literal billionaire and has robots and guns out the wazoo. And on the other, we have Knack. From the get-go, this game really throws a lot of moving pieces of a story that it doesn't seem to care about all that much. Ignoring the fact that this game's premise is just denying colonialism, it seems like the person who wrote this game doesn't really know how military contracts work. Because I highly doubt an inventor that found a rock monster would just be allowed to rock up with his rock to such an important meeting. Who actually wrote this game's story? Well, Wikipedia says it's Mark Cerny. He also appears to be the director for the game. Oh no. This won't be the last time we hear from Mark, is it? Well, since I've already started touching on it, let's talk about... I don't want to have to go through a massive Knack lore dump, but luckily for both of us, I have this. Long ago, in a land similar to ours, lived a peaceful goblin nation. They developed and designed the world around them to fit their needs. But one day, an evil set of beings invaded. They took and destroyed the land the goblins made. They were made to be outcast by this new group of inhibitors, so they plotted and planned to take their land back. The goblins' newfound technology was powerful enough for them to finally start taking their land back, which made the new inhibitors very mad. They fought back with their own technology and a rock-based being called Knack, which proved too much for the goblins, so they started to detract. Amidst all of this, a contract at stake. With foul play committed, Knack's relics were taken by the other contractor. And another thing, Knack was found by 2 people, but one went missing. After a short period of time, Knack stole the relics back and hunted down the goblin chief so they would stop the attack. Knack killed the goblin chief and the goblins scrambled back to being outcasts, and the humans gained important information. We come to find that the person who designed the goblin tech was a love interest for the archaeologist who was thought to be dead. Actually alive and well, but held hostage instead. Once the chief fell, she returned with her lover and Knack as well. A door with an orb which had power beyond belief, discovered by an enemy who had a belief. Knack was the key. That was his idea. Little did he know how wrong he would be. A literal key would open the door, split into pieces, unleashing the orb. The man evaporates and a new monster is made. Knack kills the monster and saves the day. A medal of honor our hero is bestowed, and that finishes our story with a new status quo. As a story, it is unnecessarily complicated while being very predictable. The terribly written dialogue between characters and overuse of cutscenes to tell the story makes this just painful to sit through. The story isn't fun or engaging in any meaningful way. It just feels like a lazy transition to get you to the next location in the game. It really did suck to see every single minor conversation as a cutscene. Some of these feel like they could have just have happened as background noise while the player goes through a level, rather than wasting the player's time. I would have also hoped that the man who is responsible for games like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, and Uncharted would know how important telling your story through gameplay is when trying to make your player feel connected to the character and the world they're in. The depressing lack of this in Knack really helped point out these already glaring issues to me. I think the perfect way to summarize everything that I've just said would be to point out that Knack's entire purpose in the story towards the latter half is that he was believed to open a door that he can't open. He is actually useless within the context of his own game's plot, and the only reason he's regarded as a hero is because the main antagonist got killed by their own lust for power. Also, they forget about the goblins as an entire plot point like a third way through the game, and the only reason they become relevant again was through a terrorist attack which happens randomly after you steal back Knack's relics. It felt like they had to rehash them into the story somehow because they were neglected for so long. Most of this game is dedicated to boring semi-political stuff that is very on the nose. In a game where you play as a rock monster full of relics, it came as a big surprise that this was the direction they wanted to take it with. Now, I'm not usually one to complain about politics in media, but when your politics is trying to justify arms dealers and why they should be allowed to commit genocide compared to the other one, then maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't tell this story actually. Especially considering that you're playing as a guy called Knack, for goodness sake. Have you seen him? Are you telling me that thing can handle a topic as complex as this? I would really hope not. The most amount of fun I've had with this story is when the game finally ended and I was able to see Knack bust it down to some copyrighted music. There was no point in the game where I was genuinely wanting to know what happened next, and I would have just rather the cutscenes be replaced with a level select with a brief description in the loading screen of what the level was about, rather than having 2 minutes of my life wasted to exposition that would eventually go nowhere. They also constantly talk about how the ancient relics that forms Knack's body are also the same ones that power the electricity within their society. Yet we don't get to learn a single thing about this society, and instead they decide to make a half-baked love story with a weird will they won't they in between. It's just another example of them ignoring any real mystery that this world has, and instead goes for the least satisfactory option for storytelling, something that happens quite often, sadly. One last thing I would like to quickly touch on is that Knack isn't actually the good guy here. Shock and horror, I know, but he is literally aiding the humans in what is essentially a goblin genocide. And while there are some humans that are kind of evil, none of them are the victims here really. Once all this is said and done, they get to go back home and live their lives again. The goblins will have lost everything once the story wraps up, and I think it's unfair that they get turned into villains for simply wanting to have what is rightfully theirs to begin with. There are a lot of plot points in this game that try to make you overlook this very basic point to begin with. But at the end of the day, they just want to live like the humans. And I mean, I would too if I was them. I feel so sorry for the goblins. Like, they just don't deserve this. Knack is well known for being a platformer with de-emphasized jumping. What that basically means is that if Knack is at a ledge, instead of letting the player jump down, it will play a cutscene where you can watch Knack jump. Because don't you dare try to jump for yourself, that's Knack's job and his job alone. However, contrary to popular belief, Knack does in fact have a jump, but the sections that it's used in are few and far between. And for good reason. The jumping in this game is absolutely abysmal. I would rather the cutscenes if this is what the alternative looks like. Pair that with the shockingly slow walking speed, and we have ourselves a contender for the worst movement in a video game. It reminds me a lot of those crappy shovelware titles like Ninja Breadman. The quality of both is similar, and that is terrifying to think about. While under normal circumstances, I would have said jumping being reduced to nothing more than a cutscene is an outrageous thing to do for a platformer. I'm willing to let that slide because this is the biggest blessing this game has to offer the player, as you don't actually need to play the game, which I see as an absolute win. Mike Sony once said in an interview that Knack is a mix of God of War, Katamari Damacy, and Crash Bandicoot. The only one in that list that is kind of accurate is God of War, and even then, it's a major shit in the face to something that actually resembles fun. Knack is described as a platformer beat-em-up, which is somewhat true. I would argue it's more platformer inspired than anything else, because this game is extremely combat heavy. A lot of the actual gameplay is just the player beating up someone at point A, and then slowly walking to point B, to then beat up more people. Sometimes you'll jump over some ledges, which you could see as them trying to be a platformer, but I see it as nothing more than an annoyance, because as I've said, the jumping sucks. Sometimes you'll land where you want to, but other times Knack will just clip on an invisible wall, which means you have to jump the ledge again and again and again until you finally land. And that isn't even for major platforming sections, it's just a part of traveling through levels. But when you do get to that next section, you better hold on to your sanity, because Jesus, this is gruesome. In games like God of War, you are given a wide range of items and abilities to take down your enemies in flashy and oftentimes gory ways. I have fond memories of killing enemies in God of War 2018, where after I hit them into the wall, I was given an option to play a quick cutscene where Kratos would absolutely obliterate this creature. Like Kratos' weapon was a brush and the screen was his canvas. It creates this sense of power in the player's mind and activates neurons in the right way where they're trying to replicate that same feeling. Now, interestingly enough, Knack does do something similar to this, and it took me a while to realize, but sometimes when Knack kills an enemy, it becomes slow motion, and Knack will do the same attack as before, but now it's in slow motion. Both of these are trying to achieve the same goal: impact the player's decisions. With God of War, you'll be encouraged and rewarded for your playstyle by getting to do these flashy finishing blows to enemies. And with Knack, it's kind of like jumping. He gets to decide when it happens. And while yes, these finishing moves can be a bit over the top, I'd rather have them than the alternative. Knack has a genuine lack of combat diversity. You get 3 special moves and 2 normal ones. A punch and a homing attack. That's it. Not even a kick. For Mark to compare this to God of War is a very ballsy thing to do, when he fully well knows the expectations that come with a God of War title. In case you don't, here's a very short list. So why on earth he let those words escape his air hole is beyond me. Maybe he was hoping that name-dropping God of War would cause people to froth out the mouth from glee and buy a copy of Knack then and there. But what he did do was open Knack to an insane amount of scrutiny that it wasn't open to before. As for the other 2 games, Crash Bandicoot and Knack share as much DNA as a fish in a rubber band, and the same can be said about my favorite ball-rolling individual, Katamari Damacy. The really shallow and genuinely quite hurtful comparisons rubbed me the wrong way while playing, as these comments were constantly at the back of my mind. I just fail to see how Knack is comparable to any of these games besides the surface level of, oh, it's a beat 'em up. Oh, it's a third-person platformer. Oh, you get big. If this was the case, then why not compare yourself to Battletoads? That's also a beat-em-up, but even then it has more depth in its combat than Knack. Knack has a lot of other issues besides the series' lack of combat diversity, as well as just genuinely shocking controls. So to quickly get through those, I have decided to do a short and sweet lightning round, going over everything else that just sucks in this game. The constant reuse of the same assets over and over and over again made every environment feel so samey and boring. There's a level where you walk through the same section 3 times. It's just copy and pasted with no differences. I felt like I was slowly losing my mind after walking out of one room to then be brought back into the exact same room, but this time it was the way to go forward. Another big issue that this game has is that there's only 3 to 4 enemy types that are constantly spammed. It really helped add to this feeling of boredom. On top of the lack of attacks and enemies, there are also just some very janky hitboxes. Some hits just don't register on enemies, punishing the player for no real reason. It happens a lot and it feels very unforgiving. But don't worry, because while you can't hit the enemies, they can very much hit you. The amount of damage the enemies did to the player was shockingly high, considering that Knack needs to hit them 3 to 7 times in a row. A lot of deaths just felt unjustified, as the enemy attacking had aim assist, a 10 times damage multiplier, as well as Game Shark, and that's just not fair. This entire concept of Knack getting big and small is extremely underutilized, and those segments end up feeling like a failure rather than the triumph they were hoping for. I get the whole point of it having to be within a controlled environment. It was supposed to be their supersonic moment, but the controls were just kinda weird, and the actual gameplay of it was just the exact same as before, but Knack's big now. Collectibles are also very bizarre in this game. The main way they do it is through this weird card system, and all it does is unlock quality of life features that should have been built into the main game. Every card is hidden in a chest, and you can't choose which card you get, making collecting things just as tedious as the main gameplay. They also have different versions of Knack, which are unlockable in the same way, which makes a bit more sense, but these versions of Knack have minor gameplay differences, and chances are, you'll have to have multiple playthroughs of the game to unlock a single variation. In my eyes, that's just not worth it. Knack fails spectacularly across the board to do anything it wanted to achieve. It fails at being a platformer, it fails at being a beat 'em up, its story is boring, and the overall gameplay loop is the exact same. Knack isn't bad because it's broken, or it's just not my type of thing. You're talking to Mr. Platformers right now. It's bad because it's just so boring. Now, sometimes games might be terrible, but the sound design and music are actually pretty good. A great example of this is Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. That game is notorious for being genuinely awful, but the soundtrack for that game is pretty damn good, all things considered. So it's a genuine shame that Knack is nothing like Sonic 06. Sure, that game was a broken mess, but that made it interesting. Knack is just boring across the board. So the sound design of Knack being akin to the flavor profile of Self-Raising Flour is to be expected. This is the most basic of sound design I have ever heard. It feels like it was taken directly from an audio library, and chances are, it probably was. Sound effects really do not help Knack whatsoever, and the same thing can be said about the soundtrack. Both are bland and uninspired. Both don't help the visuals, and both don't stand out in particular. The most notable thing about them is that they were done by people who have worked on films that are kind of okay. Finally, I usually don't talk about this kind of thing because talking about a game's graphics isn't actually too helpful in terms of genuine criticism, but this game looks terrible, man. Like, actually just terrible. Like, genuinely, I have never seen a AAA studio produce something that definitely has a visual art style, but that style looks f***ing disgusting. The character designs suck for every character. Knack looks big, bulky, and confusing. The humans look boring but also incorrect at the same time. And the goblins look f***ing ugly. The overall assets, much like everything else in this game, are bland and run-of-the-mill. The world that they've designed for Knack looks like something straight out of Windows XP. Green and pixelated. I mean, you guys have had time to digest what this looks like now. I think you understand how horrible this game looks.
You haven't said anything nice at all. To be honest, I'm sick of this. How dare you? No more Christmas.
Where am I?
Wait, please. Well, I didn't like the game. There are some things I didn't mind about it. I just don't think it works in its current format. Please let me finish off, man. Please.
Whatever.
While I've been pretty harsh towards Knack, there are some interesting ideas that the team played around with. Admittedly, they didn't go very in depth with these ideas, but there is evidence to suggest that there was a small amount of soul behind this game. I understand what they were going for. They wanted a brand new, big platformer IP that people could look at and be like, wow, another Sony classic. But they didn't want to make a platformer that was too challenging. So this version of Knack is what we ended up with. I feel like in its current state, this game isn't really that savable. So if I was allowed to make Knack, I would change it a lot. For starters, this isn't a platformer anymore. This is a Metroidvania now. You might be saying, that's an extreme genre jump. I don't care. Anyways, we're also going to be simplifying the Knack design down so it's not as ugly, and more importantly, it'll be easier to recognize as a character. I like the idea of a rock-based monster being made up of other rocks, so we're going to be keeping that, but we're going to make him have 8 main sections of his body, compared to like 200. However, I am keeping the stupid head design, because there is something endearing about it. This version of Knack would use the getting big and small mechanics to its advantage. I feel like the player should get the choice to sacrifice their size a lot more, as Knack never really did that, and I feel like you can do a lot with this idea. For example, getting smaller could make you weaker across the board, but you could get a small bump in health, as well as taking a few extra hits that wouldn't actually take from your main health bar. But the amount of health that you could get as a whole would be a lot less than before, unless you broke an object. That's another thing. I feel like the more you break in this game, the more you should be able to grow as a character. Now obviously, balancing this would be tough, so I do think having a size cap that can increase over time would be a solid way to manage the system. Kind of like when you get heart pieces in Zelda, I think an object should be collected for this growth in size and health. You could also use the door idea from the story of Knack as a way to open up new areas in the game, sacrificing your size for exploration. I would also love to see some form of skill tree built into this version of Knack, maybe something along the lines of the one from Ori and the Blind Forest, where you can have paths that improve your movement, combat, and quality of life shenanigans. The last path could include some of the original card ideas from Knack, but I would also love to see new ideas for this too. Knack is also partly electricity, so I feel like we could use that for some range-based attacks, as well as maybe having a thing where you could use electricity to move objects. I also like the idea of sacrificing size to make a temporary platform. I feel like there is a lot that could genuinely be done with Knack to make it a far more interesting moveset than what he currently has, and these are just some examples of how I would possibly change it. In terms of the world, I think it would be interesting to see the ancient society that Knack talked about so heavily as an explorable world for the player to get lost in. Since this society seemed to have pretty advanced technology, you can kind of do anything really. From sections of underground mines where we see these powerful rocks getting excavated, to then see how these rocks help the world above. I think it'd be pretty interesting to see all the aspects of this world from the perspective of something that got powered by the rocks. I don't really know what the story could be for this, but I'm pretty sure someone out there probably could. These are all just ideas that I've had, but I do think there is some promise within this, and I would love to see what could come from a game like this, to be completely honest with you. Being real, I think if the Knack team had more time to flesh out the original game, it could have been something pretty damn special, to be honest. It's just a shame that they didn't have the time or the resources to really make it live up to its potential.
Did you just compliment Knack?
Huh, I guess I did. Does this mean I get to go home and have Christmas now?
Okay, fine. Merry, whatever.
Oh, f*** off.